Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In towns like Eau Claire, bodies don't just show up off Highway 29. And when they do, it means something broke, something human, something violent. On a freezing February morning in 1974, a truck driver navigating the rural backroads of Dunn County pulled over near a shallow ditch. What he saw wasn't roadkill, it wasn't trash, it was the half-frozen body of a woman, face down, her coat torn, her back soaked in blood that had already turned the snow black. No one knew her name yet. No one claimed her. But that morning, what they found along that snowbank would unravel one of Wisconsin's oldest unsolved murders. A case so quiet, it took 5 decades, and the rise of forensic genealogy to hear her voice again. She was white, young. Mid-20s, they guessed. No ID, no purse, no luggage, no car anywhere nearby. She had defensive wounds on her arms and over a dozen stab wounds clustered around the shoulder blades and lower back. The depth of each suggested rage, not hesitation. She hadn't just died, she'd been hunted down and stopped mid-escape. Dunn County deputies arrived within the hour. Photographs taken that day show a narrow country road, snowbanks waist-deep, and tire impressions already fading under a new layer of snowfall. The body was 10 feet from the roadside, slumped into the ditch with one boot half off. Her hair was tangled, matted with blood. A single knit winter cap lay a few feet away, dark blue, hand-woven, and soaked through. No drag marks, no sign she was killed elsewhere. She died there. They logged it as an unknown female homicide victim. Local reports briefly called her Jane Doe, and the news cycle moved on, until 3 days later when a missing persons call from Minneapolis linked the body to 25-year-old Mary Schlais, an artist who had never made it to her exhibit in Chicago. According to family, Mary had planned to hitchhike her way there, a common but dangerous method of travel in the 1970s. She'd left on the morning of February 15th, heading southeast out of Minneapolis. That was the last anyone heard from her. Forensic technicians processed the scene using what tools they had in 1974. Blood typing, shoe print casting, and photographs from multiple angles. There were no cameras nearby, no mobile phones, no surveillance. The only physical evidence was the body itself, and that cap. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as exsanguination due to multiple deep stab wounds. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no foreign fibers, no signs of alcohol or drugs in her system. Whatever happened, it happened fast. The attack was frenzied, but short. A blitz. Mary's remains were cleaned and buried after confirmation of identity through dental records. Her family asked for privacy. A brother, in a brief statement, told the press, "She wanted to make people feel something through art. She didn't deserve this." The case was opened and stayed open. For months, then years. Detectives chased leads. One suspect had a history of violence against women, but lived 300 miles away. Another drove a black sedan seen near the area that morning, but was cleared through alibi. A key detail noted in the file: the matted wool cap had 2 long strands of hair caught inside the seam. Too fragile to remove without damage, they were stored with the cap in a temperature-controlled locker. A footnote in the evidence log read, "Potential biological evidence. Hair strands, no roots visible." In 1974, that meant nothing. Without a root, hair couldn't be typed. But in 2025, it meant everything. At the time, investigators could only rely on traditional methods: word of mouth, criminal profiles, tips from the community. The case received light coverage in the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram, faded from the city blotter, and by 1975, Mary's file was marked cold. Not closed, just forgotten. But one thing stuck with investigators even years later. David Woolner, the original lead on the case, once told a younger deputy, "I've worked 20 bodies in the field, but this one was personal. Whoever killed her didn't just want her dead. They wanted her silenced." It was a strange comment, especially given there was no known connection between Mary and any suspect. But as records would later reveal, Sergeant Woolner had tried, on 3 occasions, to get the cap retested when DNA analysis became viable in the late 90s. Each time, budget constraints pushed the request aside. Cold cases weren't a priority, until they were. In 2009, Wisconsin launched a state-funded forensic backlog review project. Hundreds of unsolved homicides were pulled from archives. The cap from Mary's case was flagged for possible reevaluation. By then, the hair was brittle. But DNA labs had advanced enough to extract mitochondrial profiles from shaft-only samples. No root needed. The strands were sent to a lab in Denver, and for the first time in 35 years, Mary's case moved forward by one small step. The profile was partial. It didn't match anything in CODIS, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement across the U.S., but it was preserved, and the case was placed into a new category, pending further genealogical triangulation. By 2023, the process had a name: forensic genetic genealogy. Still, even with that, the Mary Schlais file sat idle until a cold case analyst in Madison saw one note buried deep in the 1974 field report. Victim may have gotten into a black car traveling eastbound. Possible male driver with buzz cut, estimated 30s. And another, vehicle not registered locally, may be visiting from Twin Cities area. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to reopen the conversation. Enough to prompt a new request: full genealogical profiling of the hair sample using the newest lab techniques available as of 2023. What happened next wouldn't just reshape the case, it would redefine how modern forensics deals with silence. Not just blood, not just fingerprints. Silence, because silence keeps score, especially in Dunn County. Mary Schlais wasn't famous, she didn't make national headlines when she disappeared, but the silence around her name wasn't because no one cared. It was because the systems that were supposed to catch what happened to her weren't designed for people like her. Not in 1974. She was 25 years old, a visual artist, lived alone in a modest apartment in South Minneapolis. According to family and friends, Mary had always been independent. She didn't own a car. She relied on buses, walking, and often hitchhiking, something that, at the time, wasn't just common. It was routine, especially among young creative types living paycheck to paycheck in the Midwest. She was last seen on the morning of February 15, 1974, leaving her shared artist co-op just after 9 o'clock a.m. She'd packed a small overnight bag and was heading toward Chicago for a regional art show. According to her roommate, she had a new set of canvas prints tucked under her arm and mentioned catching a ride along I-94. She never made it. Her disappearance wasn't immediately reported. That delay, roughly 48 hours, meant everything. It wasn't until Mary failed to check in at her scheduled exhibit on February 17th that calls started going out. A local friend called the gallery, then called her apartment. Her mother, who lived in Milwaukee at the time, filed a missing persons report late on the 18th. The victim notification to Mary's family came on the 19th, 3 days after her body was found in Dunn County. The match was made through dental records based on her prior fillings and a documented dental bridge from a skiing injury years earlier. From that point, the Minneapolis Police Department coordinated with Dunn County Sheriff's Office to begin reconstructing the last known movements of Mary Schlais. That timeline became the first procedural priority. She had no credit cards, no phone, no travel records. The only confirmed sighting after leaving her apartment was from a gas station clerk near Menomonee, Wisconsin. He told investigators that a woman matching Mary's description had come in around 10:30 a.m. on February 15th asking if there was a payphone. He noted she was alone, appeared calm, and wore a dark green winter coat. That gas station was approximately 75 minutes east of Minneapolis, roughly halfway to the location where her body was found. Another statement came from a delivery driver who recalled seeing a woman walking near the off-ramp of Highway 29 around 11:15 a.m. He couldn't confirm it was Mary, but the clothing matched. He also mentioned a dark sedan pulled off on the shoulder, facing east. No plates were seen. No description of the driver. No surveillance video existed. None of those locations had cameras. There was no digital footprint to trace. The case hinged entirely on physical observation and forensic mapping, a process that in 1974 was dependent on paper logs and visual memory. Investigators sketched out a timeline based on distance, confirmed sightings, and estimated weather conditions. The murder window was narrow. Between 11:15 a.m. and 12:30 p.m., she had vanished, been attacked, and her body left by the roadside. Forensic sequencing focused next on clothing. Her coat, blouse, and pants were recovered and examined. Blood saturation matched an origin at or near the final location. No foreign fibers, no semen, no foreign hairs, aside from 2 strands later discovered embedded in the lining of the knit cap found nearby. Those hairs were brown, 3–4 inches in length, and lacked follicles, too little to identify in 1974. The pathologist's report confirmed Mary's cause of death as hypovolemic shock from penetrating trauma. Wounds were clean, narrow, and consistent with a double-edged blade, approximately 4 to 6 inches long. 12 stab wounds, 7 in the upper back, 3 near the lower flank, and 2 along the right shoulder. Defensive wounds on both forearms indicated that Mary had attempted to fight off her attacker. There were no signs of hesitation or staging. This wasn't an attempt to conceal a body. It was a dump. That detail led investigators to a preliminary theory. The killer hadn't intended to stop there. They'd panicked or lost control and disposed of her body at the first opportunity. That theory held until months passed and no one came forward. No confessions, no anonymous tips, no other linked attacks. In fall of 1974, Dunn County detectives submitted a report to the Wisconsin Department of Justice requesting a behavioral profile. The request was denied. Too little data. The FBI wasn't brought in, and no interstate linkage was made. Her case was filed locally, manually updated, and year by year, gradually buried under fresher crimes. It's worth noting, 1974 wasn't a quiet year for crime. Nationally, violent crime had reached historic highs. Bundy, Kemper, Gacy. High-profile serial murders were being discovered, and federal resources were stretched thin. Mary Schlays became another unsolved line item in a growing backlog of single female homicide, roadside dump, unknown offender. And yet the local file stayed active longer than most. Detective Woolner submitted 6 follow-up status memos over the next 4 years. Each ended with the same 3 words: no further developments. In 1979, the case was officially marked as cold. But there's one thing the file doesn't show, and something every investigator who reviewed it later noticed. The timeline, for all its simplicity, didn't explain one thing. Why Mary? She didn't match any victimology pattern at the time. No known enemies, no domestic partner, no ties to drugs, crime, or high-risk behavior. Hitchhiking was common, but roadside stabbings with no sexual motive weren't. That absence of pattern raised questions that couldn't be answered with the tools they had. In the margin of a 1983 case review, one junior detective scribbled, "If this wasn't targeted, it was opportunity. If it was opportunity, he was practiced." That note was never followed up. You don't expect the answer to be sitting in an evidence box labeled unprocessed, no forensic value. You don't expect a decades-old knit cap to carry the single thread that could pull everything together. But in this case, it did. The hat found near Mary Schlays' body was collected on-site on February 15, 1974. Dark blue, hand-knit, slightly stretched at the rim. The original crime scene tech tagged it as possible belonging to victim. It was bagged in wax paper, sealed, and logged under Exhibit 4B. That bag was then shelved in a storage room under the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, where it sat, undisturbed, for 35 years. At the time, fiber analysis was limited. DNA testing, specifically mitochondrial sequencing, was non-existent in 1974. Even in the 1990s, extracting viable data from hair shafts without roots was unreliable, so the cap remained stored, not discarded, but not prioritized. That changed in 2009. Wisconsin launched a forensic evidence reevaluation program for unsolved violent crimes. It aimed to revisit cold cases with newly available tools, advanced DNA sequencing, digital imaging, and national database cross-matching. The Schlays case was included not because of new leads, but because it met the criteria. Unsolved, physical evidence in storage, victim identified, no suspect on record. The hat was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. A microanalysis technician found 2 brown hair shafts entangled in the stitching along the interior band. No root material. But in 2009, mitochondrial DNA analysis could process shaft-only samples. That analysis yielded a partial mitochondrial DNA profile. The profile didn't match Mary. It didn't match anyone in CODIS either. At the time, that left only one option: store the result and wait. The case was upgraded to DNA profile, no match, and transferred to inactive cold case status. But that profile would eventually become the opening to the case's resolution, because by 2023, forensic genealogy had matured from theory into routine investigative tool. This process didn't rely on criminal databases. It relied on consumer-level DNA testing data, public family trees, and licensed genealogists with training in criminal pattern identification. A profile like the one lifted from the hat could now be cross-referenced against thousands of DNA donors, siblings, cousins, distant relatives, who had no idea their genetic information could be the key to solving a homicide. In fall 2023, the partial mitochondrial profile was uploaded to a secure database. The search yielded a familial link, second to third cousin range, with multiple individuals from Minnesota and Iowa. The investigative team didn't have a suspect, but they now had a direction: build a genetic family tree backward. The work was meticulous. A genealogist working with the Department of Justice traced the connections from multiple angles: birth certificates, census logs, obituaries, court records. Within weeks, the team narrowed the lineage to a cluster of 5 half-brothers, born between 1935 and 1945, all adopted or with disrupted birth records. That fact, adoption, slowed the process significantly. Paper records weren't always reliable. Some names were changed, others were sealed, but one name eventually stood out: Jonas Keith Miller, born in Illinois in 1940, arrested multiple times in the 1960s and early 1970s for robbery, assault, and battery in California and Arizona, released from prison in 1972, known address in Minneapolis in 1973, no documented employment, no record of a car, no marriage, no children, no death certificate. When his name was run through modern law enforcement databases in early 2024, a match came up: a current address tied to assisted living in Owatonna, Minnesota, alive. 84 years old, still using the same social security number, no recent criminal record. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but the team had probable cause to collect a new DNA sample, legally, covertly, and with proper judicial authorization. That step was handled by a separate agency. A discarded drinking cup collected in April 2024 was submitted to the crime lab for analysis. The result, a 100% match to the hair found in Mary Schlays' hat. That was the breakthrough. What followed was the assembly of a modern case file: digital forensics, historical court records, reconstructed timelines. Everything was reevaluated against the new primary suspect. It didn't just align, it snapped into place. Miller's known locations during 1973-1975 placed him in Minneapolis, within walking distance of Mary's apartment. Records from his prior parole noted transient behavior, no fixed housing, and periodic visits to the Eau Claire area. He had no employer at the time. His last documented interaction with law enforcement was in March 1973. Then, nothing. There was no digital trace to follow, no car rentals, no financial transactions. But geography and time matched. More than that, opportunity matched. According to one cold case analyst reviewing the records, the timeline fit too tightly to be ignored. And yet it had been, because for nearly 5 decades, no one thought to test the hairs. One of the investigators reviewing the storage records said, "If we hadn't preserved that hat properly in 1974, none of this would be possible now." That's the irony. The case didn't break because we looked harder. It broke because someone 50 years ago didn't throw away a hat. That's what made this case different. It wasn't surveillance footage. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a second victim or a pattern. It was one strand of hair that survived half a century in an evidence locker, and a system that finally caught up with what it meant. By the time the DNA hit came back in spring 2024, Jonas Keith Miller had been living in quiet anonymity for decades. He was 84 years old, a resident of a subsidized senior living facility in Owatonna, Minnesota. No criminal activity on record since the 1970s. No family, no employment history for the last 30 years. He was a man who had, on paper, vanished from relevance until science brought him back into focus. The investigative team didn't rush the arrest. They wanted confirmation beyond the mitochondrial link. In April 2024, a court-approved covert collection was executed. A discarded styrofoam cup taken from the facility cafeteria was retrieved after Miller's lunch, swabbed, sealed, and sent to the state crime lab. The results were conclusive. The DNA from the cup was a direct match to the partial hair profile recovered from the knit cap found near Mary Schlays' body in 1974. Not familial, not probable, exact. At that point, Dunn County District Attorney's Office authorized a formal arrest warrant. There was no press conference, no leak to the media, just a team of plainclothes officers who arrived at the assisted living facility with a warrant, medical personnel, and a pre-cleared secure transport van. Miller didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He was read his rights and transported under medical supervision to Dunn County Jail. The holding facility intake notes documented his physical condition, frail but stable. Cognitive screening indicated no signs of dementia or disorientation. He was lucid, cooperative, alert. The interview room was prepped in advance. No cameras, no audience, only an audio recorder and 2 detectives, both trained in elder suspect interrogation. The strategy was deliberate. No accusations, no pressure, just opportunity for disclosure. Miller's initial responses were brief. He acknowledged living in Minneapolis in the 1970s. Admitted to hitchhiking himself. Confirmed he had been incarcerated for robbery and assault in California. But when asked about Mary Schlais directly, he paused. What followed wasn't a full confession. It was what investigators call a non-denial acknowledgement. A response pattern where the suspect doesn't claim responsibility outright but stops short of denying involvement. He said he had picked up a girl once, maybe in 1974. Couldn't recall the name. Said she wanted to go to Chicago. Claimed they had a disagreement in the car, that she panicked, that he told her to get out. When asked if he remembered where that happened, he gave a vague answer. Could have been near Eau Claire. He never admitted to stabbing her, but he never denied being the last person to see her alive. The audio logs from that session were reviewed by multiple prosecutors. The phrasing, tone, and timeline, combined with forensic evidence, met the threshold for prosecutable circumstantial confession under Wisconsin law. Miller had placed himself at the scene. No other suspect existed. The physical DNA tied him directly to evidence recovered from the victim's body. There was no alibi, no misidentification possible. In May 2024, he was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide. His public defender entered a not guilty plea, and the court ordered a full psychological and medical evaluation to determine competency for trial. Throughout this process, Miller remained quiet, polite, silent during transport, cooperative during intake, but never once expressed remorse or confusion. According to one corrections officer, he acted like a man who'd been expecting this for a long time. That line raised internal debate among investigators. Had Miller thought he'd gotten away with it for good, or had he simply learned to live with it, assuming time itself would bury the truth? Either way, the silence was telling. As one veteran detective put it, people who panic confess early, people who plan wait to be cornered. Behind the scenes, the prosecution team compiled their case with extreme care. There was no physical evidence beyond the DNA, no eyewitnesses, no weapon, but they had 3 things. Timeline placement: Miller lived in Minneapolis near Mary Schlais in 1974. Forensic match: his DNA matched the only foreign evidence recovered from the crime scene. Partial acknowledgement: his interview placed him at or near the location and time of the murder. That's what the state would take to trial. As the date approached, Miller's defense counsel requested a negotiated plea to avoid trial, citing health concerns and age. In October 2024, a plea agreement was proposed. No contest to 1 count of first-degree intentional homicide in exchange for a life sentence without possibility of parole. The court accepted the terms: no trial, no testimony, no cameras. What stood out wasn't just the outcome, but how it happened. A 50-year-old case resolved not through confessions or dramatic revelations, but through methodical forensics and the quiet leverage of time. Mary's family was notified in private. A single press release followed. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office confirms that Jonas Keith Miller has entered a plea of no contest in the 1974 homicide of Mary Schlais. Justice has been served. But the story doesn't end with a headline. It ends in a courtroom. No audience, no spectacle. Just an 84-year-old man standing before a judge, nodding once before being escorted away. He never apologized, and legally, he never admitted guilt. But he's not walking free. No suspect, no weapon, no eyewitness. Yet a 50-year-old homicide resulted in a conviction because of a technology that didn't exist when the victim was killed. The forensic breakthrough in the Mary Schlais case didn't come from re-examining blood spatter or latent fingerprints. It came from DNA, specifically the application of forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. This approach combined traditional investigative methods with public genetic databases and genealogical research, allowing investigators to trace family trees backward to identify suspects through shared DNA. The sample used in this case wasn't new. It had been collected in 1974, stored properly, and overlooked for decades. 2 hair shafts embedded in a knit cap, no roots, no blood, not usable in the 1990s, but preserved nonetheless. In 2023, when the partial mitochondrial profile was resubmitted to a forensic genealogy lab, analysts used it to cross-reference genetic information donated through consumer DNA services, voluntarily submitted by people unrelated to the case but biologically linked. A second to third cousin match surfaced. That single match was the starting point of a reverse family tree. From there, a network of relatives was built. Names, locations, dates. One by one, branches of the tree were trimmed away until only one viable candidate remained. Jonas Keith Miller, male, born in 1940, lived in Minneapolis in the 1970s. No alibi, known criminal history. The lab that assisted in the genealogy process followed established ethical guidelines. No private DNA was accessed. No one was targeted without legal grounds. But the science was definitive. The match wasn't approximate, it was direct. Cases like this aren't anomalies anymore. As of mid-2025, more than 500 cold cases across the United States have been reopened or resolved through forensic genealogy. What was once a niche grant-funded strategy is now standard practice in jurisdictions with access to resources, but the process is slow, labor-intensive, and heavily dependent on preserved evidence and public trust. Mary's case is often cited in law enforcement trainings as an example of procedural chain of custody discipline. The cap wasn't thrown away, the evidence wasn't contaminated, and when the time came, the labs were ready. But technology alone doesn't close cases. Analysts still need to validate lineage. Detectives still need to verify timelines. Prosecutors still need to build a narrative based on admissible evidence. Without proper follow-through, even the most advanced DNA trace won't hold in court. In this case, it did, because each step was documented, matched, and verified. There's a lesson here about patience, but also about systems. The only reason forensic genealogy worked in this case was because someone in 1974 bagged a knit cap and stored it right. The science caught up, but only after decades of the system standing still. As one lead investigator put it, it wasn't a breakthrough, it was a backlog catching up to the truth. This isn't a message about miracles. It's about method. When cases go cold, it's not because the truth disappears. It's because the tools to find it didn't exist yet. What changed was the ability to see through silence. Mary never knew this would be possible. Her family didn't either. But now, her name is attached to one of Wisconsin's most important DNA-based cold case resolutions. And more importantly, her case has already influenced policies surrounding cold evidence retention across multiple counties. There was no jury, no dramatic testimony, no media swarm outside the courthouse, just a quiet hearing on the morning of March 27, 2025, inside courtroom 5B of Dunn County Circuit Court. After 51 years, the case of State vs. Jonas Keith Miller was coming to an end. Miller entered the courtroom using a walker. He wore a beige jumpsuit and orthopedic shoes. The room was mostly empty. No cameras, no reporters, just legal counsel, court staff, and a few members of the Schllays family seated in the back row. This wasn't a trial. There would be no cross-examinations, no opening statements. The plea agreement had already been signed. The court proceedings were procedural, not performative. Judge Alan Richter confirmed the defendant's identity, reviewed the plea, and asked if Miller understood the terms. He nodded once. His attorney responded for him. "Yes, Your Honor." He pleads no contest. Under Wisconsin law, a no-contest plea carries the same legal weight as a guilty verdict. It acknowledges the state has enough evidence to convict without the defendant admitting guilt in open court. For the Schllays family, it meant closure, legally if not emotionally. Mary's sister, who had flown in from Arizona, requested to speak. Her statement was measured, deliberate. She didn't ask for apologies. She didn't express rage. She simply reminded the court that her sister's body had been left in a ditch, that it took half a century to identify the person responsible, that Mary's life was not defined by how it ended. The judge imposed life in prison without parole, a sentence Miller would serve at a state medical correctional facility. No objections, no emotion from the defendant. He was escorted out of the room as quietly as he had entered. What made this resolution significant wasn't the courtroom drama, it was what had led to it. A case that once had no fingerprints, no confession, and no suspect now had all three by way of a single preserved hair shaft and the slow, deliberate application of science. The courtroom transcript ran under 14 pages. The entire proceeding lasted less than 40 minutes, but the timeline behind it had stretched across 5 decades, 4 generations of law enforcement, and 3 separate forensic revolutions. It was, by any measure, a case that shouldn't have been solvable. And yet it was. Outside the courtroom, the lead investigator made no statements to the press, but in a private memo filed later that week he wrote, "The evidence spoke. That's all we ever needed." Courtroom 5B didn't deliver a dramatic ending. It delivered a final, official one. And for a cold case to reach that point without error or compromise, that matters. In the months following the sentencing of Jonas Keith Miller, the Schllays case quietly faded from the headlines, if it was ever really there. No national news specials on no book deals, just a file marked closed and a series of internal briefings across law enforcement agencies nationwide. But in forensic circles, the case carried weight. At the Wisconsin Department of Justice, it was classified not only as a successful cold case resolution, but as a benchmark for the future use of forensic genetic genealogy. A 1974 murder solved in 2024, prosecuted in 2025, with no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, and no confession. The only path to truth had been a fragment of biological material and the decision, made 5 decades earlier, to preserve it. Other agencies took note. By May 2025, over a dozen sheriff's offices across the Midwest reopened dormant homicide files using similar techniques. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit cited the case in updated guidelines for handling non-sexual opportunistic roadside homicides. The National Institute of Justice added it to their official training module for digital genealogy strategy. Quietly, structurally, the Schlays case reshaped how older homicides would be approached going forward. But beyond the procedural impact, the case raised questions that no court ruling could resolve. Miller never explained why. He provided no motive, no apology, no indication of remorse. His plea was legal, not moral. And while the DNA said everything the system needed it to say, it didn't reveal intent, context, or history. It only placed a man in the orbit of a woman who ended up dead. That unanswered space remains. There were no known connections between Miller and Schlays prior to the morning she disappeared. No shared acquaintances, no physical evidence of prior stalking or surveillance. But there was something else, a pattern that never fully formed. No linked murders, no apparent history of homicide, no other victims formally tied to his name. Yet the method, brutal stabbing, rapid disposal, lack of sexual motive, aligned with a type of crime long considered transient violence. Crimes committed without warning, without logic, and without repetition. Investigators reviewing Miller's record saw red flags in his earlier convictions. Robbery with a knife in California, battery in Arizona, multiple aliases, inconsistent housing, but nothing that crossed the legal line into pattern behavior. It was enough to raise suspicions, never enough to file charges. And when he moved to the Midwest in the early 1970s, he disappeared into a background of thousands of similar men. No one watched, no one tracked. In hindsight, that's what made him dangerous. Not because he was a serial offender, but because he didn't need to be. For Mary's family, the sentencing marked a form of resolution, but not satisfaction. In a statement released privately, her niece wrote, "We didn't want closure, we wanted truth, but this will have to do." That sentence echoed among other families watching the outcome. It served as a reminder that cold cases aren't puzzles to be solved, their lives interrupted, families suspended between grief and ambiguity. Still, the case gave something back, a process that worked, a blueprint for persistence, a system that, when coordinated across generations of law enforcement, could bend toward resolution, even if not justice, in its purest form. In July 2025, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office officially archived the Schlays file under a new classification: homicide, resolved via DNA. Inside the final case report, handwritten in black ink above the final summary, was a simple line from the last lead detective. The evidence held the truth. We just had to wait long enough to hear it. Today, Mary's name appears in no public registry of famous victims. There are no memorials, no highway markers. But within forensic science, her case lives on as a testament to patience, record-keeping, and the quiet discipline of those who never close the file, even when the world forgot. Not all crimes are solved. Fewer are solved right. This one wasn't fast, it wasn't perfect, but it held, and in cold cases, that matters. Looking back on this case, what stays with me isn't just the science or the sentence, it's the silence in between. Decades passed without answers, but someone kept the file open. Someone cared enough not to forget. And that's the lesson I carry forward. Justice may sleep, but it doesn't vanish, not if we hold on. What do you think about how this case ended? Did it bring real justice or just legal closure? I'd love to hear your take. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from or what part of this story struck you the most. If this video moved you or made you think differently, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep stories like this alive and helps us ask the hard questions together.